She waved at millions, ruled for decades, and carried secrets in a handbag. But behind the crown and carefully choreographed smiles was a woman far stranger, and far funnier, than history ever let on. From custom dog whistles to coded exits, cucumber sandwiches to corgi protocol, these are the moments that never made it into the textbooks. Welcome to 53 bizarre Queen Elizabeth stories that are totally true. A royal deep dive into the delightfully weird, sharply human world of the most unknowable woman to ever be known by everyone. And no, she never needed a passport. Before we dive in, if you love strange true stories, hidden histories, and the kind of facts you definitely won't hear in school, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next rabbit hole. Also, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Lunchtime in Lagos? I want to know who's out there in the dark with us. 1. She carried a secret signal handbag. To the untrained eye, the Queen's handbag looked like any other high-end accessory. Small, boxy, unfashionably stiff, and almost always in black or cream. But to those who worked in her orbit, it might as well have been a fire alarm. When Queen Elizabeth II wanted to say something without actually saying it, she used the bag. If she shifted it from one hand to the other mid-conversation, it meant, "I'm done here." If she placed it on the floor, that was DEFCON 1, extract immediately. In rare cases, she'd twist it in her hands, which wasn't just nervousness. It was code red for a stifling bore or worse, a breach of protocol. Staff were trained to recognize the moves. A switch to the right hand? Cut in and invent a diplomatic excuse. Bag on the table? Wrap it up. Bag on the ground? Send in the fake emergency. And yes, there were rehearsed emergencies. It was less James Bond, more office politics with a tiara. But the irony was delicious. The woman whose face adorned every banknote in the realm still had to silently beg to leave awkward conversations. Some say she invented the whole system herself. Others think it was the discreet evolution of generations of royal social fencing. You'd think the monarch of an empire could just say, "I'd like to go now." But no, the crown thrives on indirection, on secrets wrapped in decorum. After all, directness is for commoners. The handbag, like everything else about her, wasn't just an accessory. It was a boundary, one with gold stitching. And if you're wondering what else was hiding in there, reading glasses, lipstick, a folded $5 note for church, and sometimes a crossword. But the real power was in what the bag didn't say, and how she made it speak anyway. Which brings us to something else she invented. Not a signal this time, but an entirely new species of dog. 2. She owned over 30 corgis and invented a new dog breed. Most people adopt dogs. Queen Elizabeth II commissioned them. Over her lifetime, she owned more than 30 corgis. Each descended from her very first, Susan, gifted to her on her 18th birthday. That dog not only lived a life of luxury, but also traveled by private jet and reportedly bit at least one royal clockwinder. But Elizabeth wasn't content with just corgis. One day, one of Susan's descendants found love, or something like it, with Princess Margaret's dachshund. The result? A stumpy, long-bodied, semi-confused creature that looked like a hot dog wearing a lion's mane. They called it a dorgie. The Queen loved it. So more were bred. Tinker, Cider, Vulcan, and Candy. Each name sounding less like pets and more like eccentric Downton Abbey footmen. The dorgie wasn't just a fluke. It was a royal innovation. A new bloodline, created not in laboratories, but in palace kennels. And yes, she fed them herself. Carefully prepared menus, no scraps, no wet food. Chicken, rice, beef, and a dose of ritual. Sometimes served on silver platters, often organized in strict feeding rotations. It wasn't just a mealtime. It was a coronation for canines. But here's the odd thing. Despite the royal treatment, the dogs were not polite. They barked incessantly, bit staff, and once tore apart a footman's trousers. Some corgis even made the queen bleed, and she reportedly brushed it off. That was just part of loving them. There's something strange and poetic about it. Elizabeth could bend countries with her presence, but not her dogs. She ruled empires, but her hallway echoed with barking mutiny, and she seemed to like it that way. Of course, not everyone recognized her while out walking them. In fact, there was one group of tourists who didn't even realize who she was, and she made sure to mess with them. By the way, if you're enjoying this royal rabbit hole, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that slip through the cracks of official history. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it on your end? Are you in bed in Brisbane? Stuck in traffic in Toronto? I want to know who's along for the ride and how weird the timing is. 3. She once pranked tourists who didn't recognize her. Somewhere near Balmoral Castle, the Queen's beloved summer escape in the Scottish Highlands, a few American tourists were out hiking. They saw a little old lady walking a few dogs, dressed plainly, wearing a headscarf. No fanfare, no security detail they could detect, just a woman on a stroll. They struck up conversation, asking if she lived nearby. "Yes," she said, with that dry twinkle behind her smile. They asked if she'd ever met the Queen. She paused, then pointed to her security officer and said, "No, but he has." No crown, no warning, just an Olympic-level troll move. The tourists had no idea. They thanked her, took a photo with her companion, and went on their way, completely unaware they'd just shared pleasantries with the longest reigning monarch in British history. The officer, a loyal protection agent named Richard Griffin, later told the story, and confirmed that the Queen absolutely loved moments like that. "It gave her great amusement," he said. In truth, she relished being incognito. There was freedom in anonymity, and even more fun in breaking it on her own terms. It's easy to forget how familiar her face was, printed on stamps, coins, textbooks, even mugs. She was a brand before there were brands. But to walk unrecognized in the land she ruled, that was priceless. She didn't take offense, she took advantage. The story is one of those rare glimpses into how sharp her humor was. Deadpan, precise, and always a step ahead. Not cruel, just delightfully aware of her own myth and how to poke a hole in it without ever tearing it down. And that's the thing. She may have been a global icon, but she didn't need to be recognized. She could disappear when she wanted, because the real power was not in being seen. It was in knowing how to vanish. And speaking of things she didn't need, how about passports, licenses, or permission slips of any kind? 4. She never needed a passport or driver's license. Imagine being so above the law needs your name just to exist. Queen Elizabeth II, quite literally, never needed a passport or a driver's license. Not because of loopholes, favoritism, or some sketchy bureaucratic hack, but because technically she issued them. Every British passport read, "Her Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State requests and requires," which meant it was a bit awkward for the Queen to request herself. So she simply didn't. No passport, no license, no ID, nothing. And yet she traveled to over 100 countries, passed through customs like a breeze, and even drove herself. No permit, no license plate. No one asked questions. Who would? It wasn't just symbolic. She genuinely loved to drive. Old Land Rovers, Bentleys, sometimes back roads, sometimes estates, sometimes winding through Balmoral like she was in a royal episode of Top Gear. But always with the same air of calm, buttoned-up rebellion. There's even a story about her driving the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who, at the time, came from a country where women couldn't legally drive. She took the wheel herself, tore down the road at speed, and delivered the most passive-aggressive political statement ever made with a leather-gloved hand. And remember, this was a woman who had been fixing engines and tuning cars since the age of 18, when she trained as a mechanic during World War II. So no, she wasn't just a passenger in a fancy family. She knew her way around a gearbox and probably could have out-paralleled most of her own chauffeurs. Yet somehow, the wildest part isn't that she got away with all this. It's that she did it quietly. No grand gestures, no declarations. Just a monarch gliding through legal norms like they were optional reading. And if you think that's impressive, wait until you hear what she actually did during the war. Not in a uniform parade or a charity drive, but in grease-stained overalls under the hood of a truck. 5. She drove trucks. During World War II. In 1945, while Europe was still burning and headlines were filled with tanks, treaties, and trauma, Princess Elizabeth Windsor did something no one expected. She got her hands dirty. Literally. At 18 years old, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, Britain's wartime women's branch, not as a figurehead, but as a truck mechanic and military driver. She trained in London, learning how to strip an engine, change tires, rebuild gearboxes, and drive a variety of military vehicles, from ambulances to jeeps. The newspapers called her Princess Auto Mechanic. She didn't seem to mind. Her father, King George VI, was hesitant. Her mother was horrified. But Elizabeth insisted. She wanted to contribute, properly, not just in photo ops. Her uniform wasn't ceremonial. Her work was real. Long hours, grease under her nails, dirt on her face. She didn't just know what a carburetor was, she fixed one. She became known as number 230873 Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor. No special rank, no golden nameplate. Just another trainee, sharing a bunk and learning to navigate bombed-out roads. The fact that she was next in line for the throne? Almost irrelevant, at least to her. The war ended months later, and she went back to being a princess. But veterans who met her later in life were shocked by what she remembered. Engine configurations, mechanical terms, even makeshift field repairs. It wasn't an act. She genuinely cared. She genuinely learned. This wasn't just about patriotism or PR. It was about control. For someone born into a life where everything was decided for her, her schedule, her meals, even her handwriting, the driver's seat must have felt like rebellion. And for the rest of her life, she kept that skill close. No one could ever say she didn't earn something herself. And perhaps that's why, decades later, she still liked her bath a very particular way. Because if you fixed a military vehicle during a world war, you deserve your water at exactly the right temperature. 6. She had a very specific way she liked her bath prepared. They called it the bath ritual, not in public, of course, but behind palace walls, it was as revered as any royal decree. Every morning, the Queen's bath was drawn to a precise depth, 7 inches, not more, not less. The water had to be exactly warm, but not hot, not tepid either. Just the right point between comfort and command. A wooden thermometer was sometimes used, just to be sure. Staff were expected to get it right on the first try. There was even a rule about the angle of the towels. They were to be placed exactly parallel to the tub, folded just so. No creases, no haphazard placement. Everything had to reflect symmetry, precision, and, above all, quiet control. To outsiders, this sounds absurd. A little diva-ish, maybe even royal parody. But think about it. When you live your life in the most gilded cage on earth, what do you actually get to control? You don't pick your name, your job, your calendar, your clothes, or even your dinner menu. But a bath? That's yours. That's sacred. And so she guarded it. The ritual never changed. She reportedly preferred long soaks, minimal bubbles, and complete silence. No knocks, no casual updates from aides. A fortress of solitude scented with soft soaps and routine. Even in her 90s, the bath remained part of her daily rhythm. It was calming, predictable. A small rebellion against the chaos of monarchy. Where the world demanded appearances and protocol, the bath offered something quieter, something sane. And if a staffer got it wrong, they weren't scolded, but they weren't asked again. But don't confuse her love of ritual with vanity. This wasn't about luxury, it was about discipline, which, as we're about to see, extended all the way to something as simple and strangely enduring as lipstick. 7. She had a favorite lipstick shade she wore for decades. When you've spent 70 years on the throne, posed for tens of thousands of photographs, and become one of the most recognized human faces on Earth, you start thinking in color theory. For Queen Elizabeth II, it wasn't just about style, it was about visibility. And somewhere in the royal arsenal of hats, coats, and brooches, a single item held surprising significance: her lipstick. The Queen's go-to shade was a vivid, unmistakable pink, rumored to be a custom blend created for her coronation by Clarins. The hue had a subtle magic to it. It popped in black and white photographs, it stood out against gloomy skies, and it cut cleanly through the grayscale of global politics and televised state dinners. It was soft, yet stubborn, a pink that said, "Yes, I'm delicate, but also, I'm not going anywhere." This wasn't a fleeting choice. She wore versions of the same shade for decades. That's longer than most fashion houses last. It became part of her uniform, just like the pearls, just like the gloves. And like everything else she wore, it was tactical. The Queen understood optics in a way most politicians never quite mastered. Bright colors made her easy to spot in a crowd. Lipstick made her expressions easier to read. She may not have been a loud person, but her face? That was public property. Staff reported she carried the lipstick with her in her handbag and would reapply with quiet precision, sometimes during events, never during meals. It wasn't vanity, it was maintenance. She wasn't trying to look glamorous. She was maintaining the brand. Consistency, after all, was part of the monarchy's deepest currency. There's something oddly human about it, too. For all the castles, corgis, and ceremonies, she still had a favorite lipstick, and stuck with it like any creature of habit. It was ordinary, and somehow, because it was hers, it became extraordinary. Speaking of routines that blurred the line between royal tradition and personal indulgence, we need to talk about her drink. Specifically, the one that had more gin than mixer. 8. She liked her gin. Very strong. If Queen Elizabeth II had a secret weapon, it wasn't power or protocol or even that famously icy stare. It was gin, specifically her signature cocktail. A stiff combination of gin and Dubonnet, often served before lunch, always served with precision. 2 parts Dubonnet, 1 part gin, a slice of lemon, no seeds, and plenty of ice. And when we say 1 part gin, well, that part was often generous. It wasn't exactly a state secret. Palace insiders, former chefs, and ex-butlers all quietly confirmed what the press often danced around. Her Majesty liked her drink strong. Not sloppy, not excessive, but strong enough to raise eyebrows and standards. To be clear, she wasn't a party queen. You didn't find her stumbling through corridors or slurring over canapes. But there was a ritual to it. A drink before lunch, maybe another in the evening. Sometimes a dry martini, other times champagne. It wasn't about inebriation. It was about punctuation. A quiet break in the monotony of diplomacy and daily briefings. She was reportedly fond of pouring the drinks herself. She knew her own ratios. She didn't need a bartender. She was the bartender. And of course, being queen, she had her own liquor brand. Buckingham Palace produced its own gin, infused with botanicals grown in the gardens. And when it was launched, people bought it not just because it was gin, but because it was hers. But here's the kicker. In later years, her doctors reportedly advised her to cut back. And like any dignified monarch, she nodded politely. and then quietly carried on as usual. There are few things more relatable than ignoring your doctor's advice in favor of personal tradition. It's telling. For someone who lived in a gilded fishbowl, who followed protocol to the letter in public, she still carved out tiny pockets of control. A lipstick shade, a drink recipe, a ritual. And in one very peculiar case, she even developed fluency in a language that's not exactly spoken. It's galloped. 9. She spoke fluent Horse. There were diplomats fluent in 7 languages who still struggled to decode the Queen. But horses, they understood her perfectly. And she understood them. From childhood, Queen Elizabeth II was obsessed with horses. Not in the I like ponies kind of way, in the lifelong encyclopedic, borderline mystical kind of way. She received her first pony at age 4. By 10, she was riding daily. By her teens, she could name the bloodlines of almost any thoroughbred in the Commonwealth. By her 30s, she could spot a flawed trot from a mile away. This wasn't a hobby. It was a second language. Stable hands and horse trainers often said the same thing. She didn't just ride well, she communicated. The Queen would approach a restless horse, place a hand just so, murmur something inaudible, and suddenly the animal would calm down, as if it had just been knighted. She bred horses, raced them, and read up on breeding techniques with the kind of focus most people reserve for tax law or fantasy football. She kept meticulous notes on each one, remembered their lineage, quirks, injuries, and personalities. She could recite race statistics better than most bookies. Her horses won over 1,600 races. One of her trainers said she could identify every horse in her stable just by the sound of its hooves on gravel. And yet, she never flaunted it. There was no pomp in the paddock, just a small woman in tweed, with mud on her boots and total command of creatures 10 times her size. It was one of the few places where she didn't need to perform. The horses didn't care about crowns or titles. They responded to tone, patience, presence. And she had all 3. Even world leaders found it unnerving. Reagan, an avid horseman himself, was stunned by her skill. She once left a visiting ambassador in the dust during a riding tour at Windsor. She didn't gloat. She just smiled. You either kept up or you learned your place. And of course, when she traveled, especially on horse-related visits, she had a way to keep it all low-key. One that involved a fake name, a private booking, and just enough misdirection to confuse a nation. 10. She used code names when traveling privately. For most people, booking a hotel room under a fake name is suspicious. For Queen Elizabeth II, it was protocol, a matter of security, and also, oddly enough, a little bit of fun. When the Queen traveled unofficially, particularly for holidays, private estate stays, or quiet retreats abroad, she used aliases. Not grand, mysterious-sounding ones like Duchess of Shadows or Agent Majestic, but hilariously ordinary ones, like Sharon or Mrs. Smith, occasionally Sutherland, a nod to one of her family's ancestral titles. Why? Because you can't exactly reserve a room under Queen of the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth realms without drawing attention. And besides, part of the appeal was the stealth. A monarch incognito. A royal booking a room like any other guest. Sort of. Her security detail had code names too. The entire entourage became a kind of traveling theater troupe, hiding in plain sight. It's said that her staff used radios and schedules with euphemisms and acronyms, and sometimes entire destinations would be referred to by odd nicknames. One former royal protection officer revealed that during certain trips, even their arrival times were logged in coded military-style timetables to throw off potential leaks. But the Queen's personal code name was always deliberately boring. That was the point. You don't draw attention as Sharon from the Cotswolds. It was camouflaged by mundanity. She might be the most famous woman on earth, but with a headscarf, sunglasses, and a drab coat, she could pass for someone's retired aunt. Someone polite, unassuming. Possibly here to visit a cousin. Definitely not here to open a parliament or knight a cricket player. It's strangely endearing. The Queen, in her later years, still playing spy games, not with martinis or Aston Martins, but with booking forms and pseudonyms. Not to deceive, but to retreat. To be a person for a moment instead of a symbol. But even symbols have their limits, especially when it comes to food. Because if there was one ingredient the Queen refused to tolerate, it wasn't exotic or elite. It was something far more common and pungent. 11. She had a deep dislike of garlic. At Buckingham Palace, no detail was too small for protocol. Silver cutlery, polished daily, napkins, folded into a precise triple pleat, and garlic, banned, completely. It's not that the Queen had a rare allergy or some dramatic vendetta against seasoning. Her disdain for garlic was far more subtle, and frankly, very on brand. She simply found the smell unpleasant, too overpowering, too aggressive, too lingering. This tiny culinary preference had sweeping consequences. Garlic was scrubbed from all royal menus. Not just in the palace, but at official banquets, state dinners, and even during foreign visits. Chefs were quietly informed. No garlic. Ever. Former royal chefs have confirmed it repeatedly. One said they had to find creative ways to add flavor without offending the Queen's nose. Onions were used sparingly. Chives were okay. But garlic? Not even a hint. You might expect this kind of fussiness from a Hollywood diva, not a head of state. But Elizabeth's reasoning was, as always, strategic. The monarchy thrives on presence, and nothing kills a good handshake like breath that could peel wallpaper. She often hosted dignitaries at close range, engaging in soft-spoken conversations over fine china. Garlic breath, in that context, wasn't just unpleasant. It was a diplomatic liability, but it also shows something else. The quiet power of preference. When you're queen, a dislike becomes a rule. A passing comment becomes policy. And somewhere in all that privilege, a simple quirk gets institutionalized. It wasn't just garlic either. She reportedly disliked too much starch in her food, was skeptical of spicy dishes, and had strong opinions on crusts, cutlery, and teacup handles. But garlic held a special place on the blacklist. It was her culinary nemesis. And yet, this tiny food aversion shaped menus across decades. Chefs trained around it. Kitchens reorganized for it. Banquets reimagined. It's one of those strange royal facts that sounds silly until you realize it's also deeply human. The Queen was powerful, but also just a woman who didn't want to smell like a kitchen. And when the apron came off and the crown was set aside, sometimes she relaxed with something far less grand, trashy television. 12. She enjoyed watching soap operas in private. Behind palace doors and layers of protocol, Queen Elizabeth II had a secret indulgence. Soap operas. Not royal dramas, not historical biopics, actual soaps. The kind of television your gran watches at 7 p.m. while eating toast. Word has it she was fond of Coronation Street EastEnders and occasionally dipped into The Bill or Downton Abbey, though that last one reportedly amused her for all the wrong reasons. This wasn't some passing curiosity, it was routine. After a day of briefings, ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, and dignitary dodging, she would reportedly retire to her private quarters, sip her evening drink, and switch on the telly. Remote in hand, feet up, no press, no pretense. It's hard to imagine the Queen, in pearls and pumps, getting emotionally invested in fictional pub brawls or small-town scandals. But therein lies the brilliance. For someone whose entire life was scripted, scheduled, and scrutinized, there was something soothing about unscripted chaos. Drama that had nothing to do with her. Catfights that didn't end in constitutional crises. And unlike her public appearances, No one cared how she looked while watching. She could yell at the screen. She could chuckle. She could shake her head at plot twists and ridiculous dialogue. The soaps offered what the monarchy never could: normalcy. It's said that sometimes staff could hear the television from the corridor, muffled laughter, or the faint swell of theme music behind heavy doors. No official records exist of her favorite characters, but rumors suggest she had a fondness for long-running matriarchs, women who, like her, ran their empires from living rooms. It's easy to forget that beneath the crown was a person, one who craved a bit of escapism. And while some monarchs buried themselves in books or went hunting or wrote poetry, Elizabeth? She just wanted to watch people argue about laundry in a fictional cul-de-sac. Of course, unlike those soap opera characters, she kept a record of her own life, one no screenwriter could touch. Because she wasn't just watching stories unfold, she was quietly writing her own. 13. She kept detailed diaries every single day of her reign. Most monarchs leave behind portraits, policies, and plaques. Queen Elizabeth II left something far more mysterious: a lifelong paper trail of private thoughts penned daily, without fail. From the moment she ascended the throne in 1952, and likely even before, Elizabeth kept a personal diary. Not dictated, not ghostwritten, handwritten, by her, for her, in her own precise cursive. Entries recorded where she'd been, whom she'd met, what was said, what was not said, and perhaps what she really thought of all of it. No one outside her innermost circle has read them. No aides, no historians, not even close family, as far as we know. The contents remain sealed. Literally. They are guarded, archived, and treated like the holy grail of royal documentation. A complete, uninterrupted log of a monarch's unfiltered reactions to 7 decades of global upheaval. Wars, weddings, scandals, coronations, abdications, moon landings, divorces, plagues, politicians, all captured not by the press, but by the only person in the world who watched it all unfold from the throne. Imagine the notes from her meetings with Churchill, her thoughts during Diana's funeral, her unspoken impressions of Kennedy, Mandela, Trump, the shade she may or may not have thrown at a misbehaving corgi. And here's the kicker: we may never see them. There's no legal requirement for their release. They're not public documents. They're personal reflections. And Elizabeth was famously private. She never gave a tell-all. She avoided public interviews. Her voice was rarely recorded outside of scripted Christmas messages. The diaries were her only unedited outlet. It's one of the great literary mysteries hiding in plain sight. If revealed, they could change how we view entire chapters of modern history, or they could be shockingly mundane. Perhaps that's the point. The allure of a monarch who saw everything and said almost nothing, but may have written it all down. Until then, we're left with the silence. And the lingering question: what does a queen write about when no one's watching? Well, sometimes when everyone was watching, she decided to surprise them. Like that time she made an unexpected entrance with James Bond. 14. She once appeared in a James Bond sketch. You don't expect the Queen to jump out of a helicopter. And yet, in 2012, millions of viewers around the world watched a short film in which Her Majesty, wearing a peach dress and carrying her signature Launer handbag, greeted James Bond at Buckingham Palace, and then leapt out of a chopper over the London Olympic Stadium. Technically, it wasn't her who jumped, but for a moment, we all suspended disbelief. Because the part before the stunt double? That was real. That was her. Daniel Craig, playing Bond, arrives at the palace. A corgi scurries past. The Queen turns from her desk. "Good evening, Mr. Bond," she says. Deadpan, flawless, and entirely unexpected. The idea came from director Danny Boyle, who, half-jokingly, asked if the Queen might be willing to participate in the Olympics opening ceremony film. To his shock, she didn't just agree. She wanted to act. She even insisted on having a line. And not just any line, that line. Royal aides were stunned. The crew was sworn to secrecy. Even senior palace staff didn't know until the night it aired. For decades, the Queen had cultivated an image of stern duty, reserved detachment, ceremonial grace. And now here she was, starring in what may be the greatest royal prank in modern history. The reaction? Shock. Then laughter. Then applause. The Queen had pulled off something truly rare. A collective, global double-take. She wasn't just playing along, she was in on the joke. And as always, she remained unreadable. No smirk, no wink, just that slight glint behind the eyes. But more than a clever cameo, it revealed a secret weapon she'd been using for years. One most people never noticed. Her timing, her comedic instincts, her sense of theatrical restraint. Because while the Queen rarely spoke out loud in public, she knew exactly how to make a moment land. Even if that moment involved an imaginary skydive over London. And yet, even without special effects or cameras, she could still silence a room, not with words, but with nothing at all. 15. She disliked small talk and let silence linger. Most public figures are trained to fill awkward silences. Queen Elizabeth II? She weaponized them. Small talk, the lubricant of social events, the polite fluff of banquets and diplomatic handshakes, wasn't her thing. She didn't hate conversation. She just didn't waste it. If you sat next to her and stumbled into a dull topic, you might be met with nothing. A long pause, a distant look, a sip of tea, and then, maybe, a single word reply. Or worse, a flat, "Oh?" For decades, guests were left squirming in the elegant emptiness of royal silence. Heads of state, celebrities, CEOs. Everyone from Tom Hanks to foreign ministers came prepared with charming anecdotes, only to be met with the kind of silence that makes your soul question its own story arc. But here's the twist. It wasn't coldness. It was intentional. The Queen believed that not all moments needed words. That silence, when wielded properly, could be more powerful than chatter. She didn't rush to reassure nervous guests. She let the silence hang there like fog in a Scottish valley. Some found it unnerving. Others found it oddly comforting. A few, usually the smart ones, realized it was a kind of test. Could you survive the silence? Could you match her pace? Could you earn the next line? She wasn't rude. She was efficient. If she liked you, you'd know it. Maybe not in words, but in a second helping of dessert or a glint of amusement. If she didn't, you'd still get the same handshake, the same smile. And then that silence again, the royal equivalent of, "We're done here." It became one of her most underrated tools, a silence that wasn't empty, but loaded. With judgment, humor, thought, or a polite invitation to change the subject now. And when the moment became truly unbearable, she had a phrase, just 2 words, always polite, and almost always a royal red flag. 16. She had a favorite phrase for awkward moments. The Queen was a master of diplomacy, but even she had her limits. Not every conversation could be salvaged. Not every guest dazzled. Not every foreign dignitary was a glittering intellect. And in those moments, the awkward ones, the rambling ones, the "dear heavens, is he still talking?" ones, Queen Elizabeth II would often deploy a phrase as polite as it was passive-aggressive. How interesting. That's it. 2 words, delivered with a smile that hovered just north of sincere. And if you weren't paying attention, you might think she meant it. You might even feel flattered. But for those who knew her well, aides, family members, longtime guests, it was code. Royal shorthand for, "This conversation is circling the drain." She didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't interrupt. She simply let, "How interesting" float into the air like a verbal paperweight, pinning down whatever nonsense had just been said and moving on. It wasn't cruel. It was precise. She didn't believe in confrontation, especially not in front of others. But she did believe in boundaries, and those two little words were her velvet rope. Some say she used it when confronted with boring trivia. Others claim it came out when guests made ill-informed political observations, or worse, tried to be funny. What made it effective wasn't just the phrase, it was the timing. She never rushed it. She let the awkwardness breathe, then gently sealed it with, "How interesting," like a stamp on a letter you're never going to read again. And somehow, it worked. People didn't argue. They didn't protest. They just stopped. The moment shifted, the topic changed, and the Queen reclaimed her conversational throne. But not everyone got the hint. And when small talk failed and code phrases fizzled, she turned to more reliable company, her corgis. Not only did she feed them herself, but she did it with a level of care that would have made most Michelin chefs blush. 17. She fed her corgis herself. You'd think the Queen had people for that, and she did, armies of them, footmen, chefs, valets, handlers. But when it came to her dogs, particularly her beloved corgis, Queen Elizabeth II took matters into her own impeccably gloved hands. Each day, the royal corgis, and later, Dorgas, were served meals prepared in the palace kitchens, not generic kibble in plastic bowls. No, these meals were curated. Chicken, beef, lamb, sometimes rabbit, all chopped, cooked, and mixed with rice and vegetables in precise proportions. But the last step, the most important step, that was hers. She would personally dish the food, portion it, arrange it, and serve it. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The dogs weren't accessories, they were companions. More loyal than politicians, less exhausting than courtiers, and infinitely more honest than the tabloids. This daily ritual, Queen and corgis in their own little world, was a non-negotiable part of her routine. She was said to speak to them as she worked, narrating, chatting, sometimes offering a royal critique of their manners. They ate in order of seniority, naturally. The older dogs first, the younger ones waited. Even canine monarchy required a hierarchy, and they weren't spoiled exactly, just institutionally pampered. They had their own room, their own footmen, custom-made cushions. But the Queen's personal involvement set the tone. She didn't delegate affection. She delivered it, one plate at a time. Even palace staff respected the ritual. Interrupting the Queen mid-dog feeding was unthinkable. It was her version of peace, her moment to care for someone who didn't expect speeches or small talk or ceremonial duties. Just food, just presence. And as if that weren't enough, the Queen had something even more unusual to go with it. A whistle. Not just any whistle. A custom-tuned, royal frequency-only dog whistle. 18. She had a custom whistle for her dogs. Yes, it's true. Queen Elizabeth II, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and Defender of the Faith, also carried a bespoke dog whistle, one that only her dogs responded to. Not trainers, not handlers, just her. It was pitched at a frequency specially designed for her pack of corgis and dorgas, tuned to their ears and their ears alone. The moment she used it, they came running, paws clicking down palace hallways like furry missiles homing in on a velvet target. Why bother with a custom whistle when you can simply call out? Because the Queen didn't shout. She didn't bark orders. She didn't need to. When your entire life is a ceremony, even dog calls are dignified. This wasn't some novelty from a pet store. It was commissioned, crafted, likely tested and refined, just like her lipstick or her fountain pens. A tool of quiet command. And more than anything, it reinforced the central truth about the Queen's relationship with her animals. It was personal. Deeply so. She didn't just love dogs, she understood them. She trained them. She played with them. She knew their rhythms, their moods, their subtle forms of rebellion. And they knew her. Her voice, her scent, her rules. The whistle was just the final punctuation. The thing that said, "Come to me now," no matter how large the estate or how distracted the squirrel. Visitors were often stunned by how fast the dogs obeyed. Not out of fear, but familiarity, respect maybe, or just decades of practice. She didn't have to raise her voice because the sound of that whistle carried something stronger than volume. It carried consistency. In a palace full of courtiers, clamor, and chaos, the queen had found a way to maintain order with a flick of the wrist and a sound only four legs could hear. And just as she made herself visible to her dogs in sound, she made herself visible to her subjects in color, always bright, always bold, always unmistakable. 19. She wore bright colors on purpose. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was a strategy. Queen Elizabeth II didn't wear neon yellow, bright pink, lime green, or electric blue because she loved looking like a highlighter. She wore them because she understood something most royals never fully embraced. Visibility is power. "I have to be seen to be believed," she once said. And she meant it. When you're 5 feet 4 inches tall and often surrounded by a sea of black suits, military uniforms, or dark winter coats, you don't stand out naturally. So the queen stood out deliberately, not just for vanity, for function. If someone waited 8 hours in the cold just to catch a glimpse of her from behind a police barrier, they should at least be able to spot her hat bobbing through the crowd. And the colors weren't random. Each outfit was chosen carefully with her team, designed to stand out against the background of the day's event. Green for the gardens, blue for the sea, orange for gray London skies. A whole chromatic code existed around her appearances. Her hats matched her coats. Her umbrellas matched both. Even her brooches followed a secret logic. And then there was the purse, always the same brand, always structured, always present, like a visual anchor in every ensemble. But what most people missed was that the brightness wasn't for her. It was for everyone else. For the people on the outside looking in, the crowds, the school children, the distant relatives who brought binoculars. It was an act of accessibility wrapped in couture. And of course, it worked. Her silhouette became iconic. The hat, the coat, the gloves, the bag, rendered in unapologetically cheerful hues even when the occasion wasn't. She could make funeral black seem regal and taxicab yellow seem stately. Because if you can't get close to royalty, the least you can do is see her. But for all her polish and precision, there were still moments when the queen wasn't poised. In fact, once, she quite literally tumbled. And what happened next says everything about how she saw herself. 20. She once fell out of her carriage and laughed it off. It sounds like a headline from a satirical tabloid. Monarch ejected from golden carriage. But this wasn't fiction. Queen Elizabeth II, known for her unshakable composure and choreographed grace, once took a rather unexpected tumble, right out of a royal carriage. It wasn't during a global broadcast or major state event, thankfully. It happened on the grounds of one of her estates, in a more private setting. The queen was stepping down from her horse-drawn carriage, the kind that looks like it rolled straight out of a fairy tale, when something went slightly off. Her foot missed. The steps shifted. Gravity got bold. And just like that, the sovereign found herself briefly unseated by physics. But here's the best part. She didn't scream. She didn't call for aids. She didn't glare or scold or flinch. She got up, dusted herself off, and laughed. That laugh, quick, dry, and genuine, said everything. No drama, no panic, just a woman who knew better than to let a stumble become a spectacle. Even when you're the Queen of England, you're still human, and humans fall down sometimes. Her companions, reportedly horrified, tried to rush to her aid, but she waved them off. No harm done, she may have said, possibly even with a pun. And then she carried on with her day, unbothered. The moment never became official palace lore. No public statement was made. No photos were released. But those who witnessed it never forgot it, not because it was a blooper, but because it was revealing. You expect a monarch to be dignified. You don't expect her to bounce. And that was one of her secret strengths. She didn't take herself too seriously. Not when it counted. The crown was heavy, yes, but she knew how to let it sit lightly when the moment called for humility. Which brings us to another obsession, one far less emotional, but no less intense. The Queen didn't just manage people, she managed time, obsessively. 21. She was obsessed with timekeeping. To rule a country, you need more than diplomacy and tradition. You need punctuality. And Queen Elizabeth II didn't just value punctuality, she worshipped it. Clocks in Buckingham Palace weren't merely decorative, they were sacred, maintained with military precision by a dedicated clockmaster whose sole job was to wind, adjust, and care for hundreds of timepieces spread throughout royal residences. Grandfather clocks, carriage clocks, antique clocks older than most countries, all had to be correct, to the minute, always. And the Queen? She knew if one was off. She was said to be able to sense a delay of mere seconds in her schedule. If an event ran late, she didn't fume, but she noticed. She'd glance subtly at her wristwatch, or raise one eyebrow. Sometimes she'd make no comment at all, and that silence would do more than any outburst. Punctuality wasn't about efficiency for her, it was about respect. Being late to meet the Queen wasn't just rude, it was breaking an unspoken covenant, a disruption of rhythm in a life built entirely around ritual. Her personal routines followed the same rules. Breakfast at exactly 8:30. Daily red boxes of government documents delivered at a fixed hour. Scheduled phone calls. Walking the dogs. Tea time. The machinery of monarchy ran on her internal clock. Even daylight saving time became a moment of royal significance. Twice a year, staff would adjust over 1,000 palace timepieces by hand. No shortcuts, no digital settings. Every clock mattered. But behind all this order was something more revealing. The Queen's obsession with timekeeping reflected her deeper awareness of time itself. She was always aware of the ticking, the passing, the weight of legacy, of being a figure trapped in history while still living in the present. For someone whose reign stretched across generations, time wasn't just something to manage. It was something to guard. And if you were part of her staff, there was one thing you definitely didn't want to do in her presence: grow a beard. 22. She disliked facial hair on men. There were no official memos, no outright bans, no velvet cloak declarations. And yet, within palace walls, everyone knew. Queen Elizabeth II had a quiet but unmistakable distaste for facial hair, especially on men who worked close to her. Not that she couldn't appreciate a rugged beard in a portrait, or a historical figure with some serious mutton chops, but in her immediate company, clean-shaven was the expected standard. Whispers among palace staff suggested that beards were discouraged, and over time it became a kind of unspoken dress code, like the tie, the polished shoes, or the proper bow. It wasn't personal, it was aesthetic. Beards in her eyes were too informal, too unkempt, too rebellious for the finely tuned clockwork of royal ceremony. A beard disrupted the symmetry. It made photographs look off. And more than once, aides or footmen were politely suggested to tidy up, or simply remove the fuzz altogether. There were exceptions, of course. Foreign dignitaries couldn't be expected to shave at the palace gates. And certain royals, most notably her grandsons, grew the occasional beard. But even then, there were murmurs that the Queen was not a fan. She never forced the issue, but her facial expressions occasionally did the talking. One palace insider once joked that Her Majesty had a sixth sense for stubble. She could spot a 5 o'clock shadow in the middle of a military parade, and if you were lucky, you'd just get a glance. If you weren't, You'd get that measured pause and a single royal observation. That's new. But again, it wasn't cruelty. It was consistency. The Queen came from an era where order meant appearance, where clean-shaven faces meant discipline, control, decorum. And more than anything, she liked things to be just so. Still, if you were lucky enough to break through that layer of regal expectation, you might have been rewarded with something far more unexpected. A flash of wit. Dry, sharp, and always on time. 23. She had a hidden sense of humor. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy. It didn't perform for cameras or courts. But Queen Elizabeth II had a sense of humor so dry, it could qualify as a desert climate. Those who knew her best, longtime staff, family members, and the rare outsider who'd earned her trust, described a woman who could drop a one-liner with surgical precision. She didn't laugh easily, but she could laugh, and when she did, it came like a sharp, clean snap, quick, unexpected, and strangely musical. Her humor lived in the pause, the raised eyebrow, the slight tilt of the head, the perfectly timed, "Oh, really?" that could deflate an ego or mock a blunder without a hint of actual insult. One aide called it the royal roast, but with gloves. She was a master of the callback. Once, when told a bishop had fallen asleep during one of her speeches, she reportedly asked, "Did he wake in time for the blessing, or shall I repeat it?" On another occasion, after being shown a modern art piece that was particularly abstract, she paused and asked, "Was it hung the right way up?" Even her official Christmas speeches, famously formal affairs, sometimes carried sly little zingers buried beneath layers of script. You had to be listening, closely. It wasn't that she didn't like to laugh. It's that she didn't need to prove it. And that made her moments of humor land harder, cut sharper, last longer. They were rare, and therefore valuable. Sometimes she even used it as a tool of deflection. When asked about a difficult topic, she'd change the subject with a joke, not to avoid, but to redirect. Humor was a kind of authority, a silent scepter. And if you were really lucky, truly in her good graces, you might notice something else, a trick that seemed almost magical. She didn't just know faces, she knew footsteps, yours included. 24. She could identify anyone's footsteps. This one sounds like myth, a charming exaggeration, a fairy tale told by butlers and whispered among palace staff. But time and time again it was confirmed. Queen Elizabeth II could identify her staff, sometimes even guests, by the sound of their footsteps, not their voices, not their outfits, not their perfume or cologne, their walk. It started, reportedly, in her younger years. Living in a world of routine, she became hyper-aware of rhythm, the clack of heels, the shuffle of leather soles, the pacing of hurried aides, or the tiptoeing of nervous valets. Each person walked a little differently, and the Queen, with her sharply tuned instincts, catalogued those differences without even trying. A particular stride pattern meant her private secretary was approaching, a slightly uneven tempo. That was the footman who carried tea but always forgot the lemon. A quick, efficient cadence? Likely her head maid. A heavy, uncertain step? Probably a new staffer, not long for the job. Staff members used to test the theory, change their shoes, adjust their pace, but somehow she still knew. Once during a late afternoon at Windsor, a new equerry was walking down a corridor and paused outside her sitting room. Before he could knock, she called out from inside, "No need to announce yourself. I heard it wasn't Paul." Paul, his predecessor, had a much quieter walk. It wasn't meant to intimidate. If anything, it made her seem more present, aware of her surroundings in a way that was oddly comforting. You couldn't sneak up on her, not because she was surrounded by guards, but because she noticed everything, even the way your heels touched the carpet. In a world where most people saw her only as a symbol, distant, polished, remote, this ability revealed something intimate. She paid attention, even to things others missed. And when it came to posture, gait, and public decorum, she didn't just observe, she corrected, especially when it came to how you sat. 25. She had a strict rule about crossing her legs. Royal protocol is an invisible force. It doesn't shout or shove. It corrects with a glance, a subtle cough, or, in Queen Elizabeth II's case, a lifetime of example. One of her lesser-known but strictly enforced standards: how one should sit. Specifically, how not to cross your legs. For the Queen, proper posture was not a suggestion. It was structural integrity. You didn't slouch, you didn't fidget, and you most certainly did not cross one knee over the other, especially not in public. That was considered too casual, too relaxed, too Hollywood. Instead, there was a preferred method, known in etiquette circles as the Duchess slant. Legs placed together, angled slightly to one side, with the ankles discreetly crossed if at all. Elegant, composed, camera-friendly from every angle. And yes, she had it perfected decades before social media influencers started mimicking it on red carpets. It wasn't just about optics. It was about containment. The Queen understood that everything, posture, gesture, expression, sent a message. Crossing legs at the knee could shift a skirt, reveal too much leg, or create an uneven silhouette on camera. And when you're a symbol of continuity and restraint, you don't want a wardrobe malfunction breaking that illusion. She modeled this rule so consistently that others followed, consciously or not. Young royals, visiting dignitaries, even celebrities. You could spot the ones who had done their homework based on how they sat beside her. Those who didn't? Well, they often got cropped out of the official photo. Even in her later years, when comfort might have tempted a more relaxed position, the Queen remained upright, legs angled, spine straight, hands folded. The embodiment of composure in human form. It's a small detail perhaps, but royalty is made of small details. And if she could enforce protocol with nothing more than a seated pose, imagine how she responded to speed, or rather, the lack of it, especially when behind the wheel herself. 26. She enjoyed fast cars, but hated speedboats. It's easy to forget when watching her wave serenely from balconies that Queen Elizabeth II had a bit of a lead foot. Not reckless, never reckless, but firm, intentional. The Queen liked to drive, and not just to be chauffeured. She liked to be in control of the vehicle. She had a long-standing love affair with fast cars. Land Rovers, Jaguars, even an Aston Martin or two. It wasn't for show. She could fix engines, knew her gears, and reportedly handled backcountry terrain at speeds that startled even her security. Her favorite car? The Land Rover. Tough, reliable, and just posh enough. She'd often take the wheel herself during trips around Balmoral or Sandringham, her corgis riding shotgun, wind rustling her scarf, staff gripping the armrests. But when it came to speed on water, the enthusiasm vanished. Speedboats? No thank you. Despite having access to some of the world's finest yachts and royal naval vessels, she never quite warmed up to fast-moving boats. Too loud, too unstable, too splashy. She preferred the calm, ceremonial glide of a barge or a gently drifting launch across a quiet lake. Maybe it was a control thing. Cars responded to your hands, your feet, your instincts. Boats? They relied on water, weather, and other people. That didn't suit her style. She was not the sort to enjoy bouncing across choppy waves, hair flying, teeth rattling. She didn't need an adrenaline rush. She needed stability. This contrast, thrill on land, caution on water, says a lot about her psychology. The Queen was not reckless, but she liked precision. Driving a car offered that. A speedboat did not. And in case you think that meant she was timid, allow us to introduce a moment that proves the opposite. A time she deliberately floored it, just to make a point. Her passenger? a Saudi prince. 27. She once scolded a Saudi prince for driving too slowly. It was the 1990s, and Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, not yet king, was visiting Balmoral. The Queen, ever the hostess, invited him for a tour of the estate. Polite conversation, tea, perhaps a stroll through the grounds. What he got instead was an unscheduled driving lesson. From her. As the story goes, after lunch, the Queen offered to take the prince for a drive. He agreed, expecting to be chauffeured. Instead, Elizabeth climbed into the driver's seat of her Land Rover and motioned for him to join her. Hesitantly, he did. What he didn't expect was for her to floor it. The Queen drove with confidence and surprising speed, tearing down narrow Scottish roads with the precision of someone who'd been doing it since the war. Because she had. The prince, reportedly alarmed, clutched the dashboard and begged her to slow down, his interpreter nervously relaying his concerns. She didn't. Instead, she smiled. Politely, perhaps a bit mischievously, and kept going. It wasn't just about speed. It was symbolic. In Saudi Arabia at the time, women were not permitted to drive. And here was a woman, a monarch no less, driving the future king of Saudi Arabia at high speed through her own land. No bodyguards, no chauffeurs, just control. Total, absolute control. It was, in many ways, the most British protest imaginable. Subtle, dry, perfectly timed, and utterly unforgettable. The Queen never commented on the incident. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered, not in words but in revs. But for all her quiet boldness, there were other domains where she preferred a gentler touch. Sandwiches, for example, specifically cucumber ones. With the crusts off, because even when you're a sovereign, lunch still matters. 28. She had a favorite sandwich. Cucumber, no crusts. There's something oddly powerful about knowing what the Queen liked for lunch. Not the 5-course state banquet kind of lunch. The quiet, behind-the-scenes, I'll have my usual kind of lunch. And for Queen Elizabeth II, the answer was refreshingly humble. Cucumber sandwiches, no crusts, always rectangles, never triangles, served with tea, always with tea. It sounds quaint, almost like a child's afternoon snack, but in royal circles, it was serious business. The preparation had rules. The bread had to be fresh and thin, usually white or very lightly buttered. The cucumbers were peeled, sliced impossibly thin, and sometimes lightly seasoned with mint or a whisper of salt. But never garlic. That would have been grounds for exile. The crusts were meticulously removed, of course, not for pickiness, but for presentation, a long-standing tradition in British afternoon tea culture that the Queen upheld religiously. Triangles were considered too informal, too party platter. Rectangles? Rectangles were dignified. And yes, she ate other things. Her former chef revealed a rotating list of simple favorites: salmon, ham, egg mayo. But the cucumber sandwich remained a constant, a classic symbol of understated refinement. It was predictable, familiar, comfort food for a monarch whose life was anything but casual. There's something endearing about it. This woman presided over a global realm, met with world leaders, signed off on nuclear protocols, and yet, in the middle of all that, paused for a cup of tea and some crustless cucumber rectangles. But in that pause was a ritual, a reminder that tradition matters, even in the smallest details, especially in the smallest details. And if you wanted to impress the Queen, you didn't need caviar or truffle foam. You just needed to cut your sandwiches properly. Of course, if you wanted to annoy the Queen, you didn't need to do much at all. Just show up in scuffed shoes. 29. She disliked untidy shoes. Some people notice faces. Some notice body language. Queen Elizabeth II? She noticed shoes. Specifically, whether yours were polished or not. It's one of those strange, very specific royal standards that caught people off guard. You could be the most powerful person in the room, wearing a custom-tailored suit and delivering a flawless speech, but if your shoes were dusty, creased, or heaven forbid, scuffed, she'd clock it instantly. She wouldn't say anything. That wasn't her style, but the glance was unmistakable. A quiet, polite glance down, lasting no more than half a second, followed by a slightly longer than normal pause before the handshake. Subtle, surgical, absolutely brutal. Former aides and palace staff knew the rule well. Shoes had to be shined to a near-mirror finish, even inside the palace. Even if you weren't likely to be seen. Even if you were just walking past her while she was feeding the corgis. If your shoes looked tired, you looked tired. And the Queen did not tolerate visual fatigue. It wasn't just about footwear. It was about discipline. In the Queen's world, shoes told a story. Were you prepared? Did you take pride in small things? Did you understand that appearances weren't superficial? They were part of your role? She applied the same standard to herself. Her shoes were always spotless, her handbag always structured, her gloves always immaculate. There were no off days when it came to presentation. It's easy to laugh at, of course. The Queen cared about scuffs. But when you live a life in which every moment is photographed, every expression dissected, every appearance documented, the small things become enormous. A clean shoe says, "I'm ready." A scuffed one? That says, "I didn't think this moment mattered." And when your job is to embody continuity, you don't get to decide which moments matter. They all do. So she kept her shoes polished. And just to make sure the rest of her performance remained sharp, she even practiced something that most of us assume is instinctive: waving. 30. She practiced waving in the mirror. Yes, that royal wave, the one you've seen 1,000 times. Small, slow, dignified, almost mechanical, was rehearsed, practiced, refined, in front of a mirror. To be fair, it had to be. Waving, when you do it once in a while, is casual. But when you're the Queen of England, waving becomes part of your identity. You wave at state arrivals, at balcony appearances, at parades, at weddings, at funerals, at Commonwealth Day, on stamps, in murals, on novelty mugs. And so, Queen Elizabeth II perfected it. The movement was modest, a slight gentle rotation of the wrist, arm bent at the elbow, hand held high enough to be seen, but never exaggerated. No big arcs, no flapping, no jazz hands. That would be undignified. The wave conveyed a message. I acknowledge you, I see you, but I remain apart from you. It was ceremonial body language, as much about boundaries as it was about friendliness. But what's fascinating is that she worked on it. It wasn't instinct, it was design. She reportedly stood in front of a mirror as a young woman, testing different gestures. Too stiff? Too floppy? Too regal? Too robotic? The goal was to find something perfectly balanced, personal yet distant, human yet elevated. Over the years, the wave evolved. In later decades, it became even more subtle. Less movement, less strain. And sometimes just a slight tilt of the wrist from inside the car window. Minimalist, efficient, unmistakable. It's easy to underestimate how tiring it is to wave that often, to that many people, for that many years. The Queen didn't just wave. She performed the wave, repeatedly, under all weather conditions, while being watched by millions. And every single time it had to look graceful. Because the second it didn't, it would be on front pages. Queen appears tired. Is monarch losing energy? So she rehearsed, just like any performer. And speaking of rehearsed, prepared, and perfectly timed, did you know she even carried coins in her handbag just in case she passed a church collection box? 31. She kept coins in her handbag to feed church collection boxes. Among the Queen's many trademarks, The pearls, the brooches, the omnipresent handbag. Few items have generated more speculation than that little purse. What was in it? Lipstick? Reading glasses? A tiny crown? Turns out, one of the most practical and oddly charming contents was loose change. Specifically, coins, carried not for vending machines or parking meters, but for church collection boxes. Every Sunday, when Queen Elizabeth II attended a service, whether at Windsor, Balmoral, Sandringham, or even during travels abroad, she would be ready. When the offertory plate came down the aisle, she didn't just nod politely. She contributed, personally, quietly. No pomp, no drama, just a gloved hand slipping a coin into the collection. This wasn't a photo op or an act of PR piety. It was part of her routine, a habit from her deeply ingrained Anglican upbringing and her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. To her, the ritual mattered. It was respectful, thoughtful, expected. The staff knew about the coins. Some even made sure her purse was always stocked before services. And yes, it was real money, not symbolic tokens. A pound or two, perhaps, modest by royal standards. But that wasn't the point. What's striking is how consistent she was. Whether she was on holiday in Scotland or fulfilling formal duties in London, the coin drop remained part of the Sunday choreography. It was one of those small, precise actions that said, "I do my part." It also revealed something deeper about her. For all the grandeur and gold of monarchy, she understood the value of small gestures. She didn't throw money around, she carried it with purpose. A quiet nod to faith, tradition, and the importance of showing up, even in little ways. And if that surprises you, you'll be equally fascinated by another of her unexpected passions: pigeons, specifically racing them. 32. She was fascinated by pigeons. Not peacocks, not swans. Pigeons. The birds most people associate with train stations and scattered crumbs were, for Queen Elizabeth II, a source of genuine fascination. And not just the kind that flaps around the palace gardens. We're talking racing pigeons, the elite athletes of the bird world. It all started with her grandfather, King George V, who kept a royal loft at Sandringham. Elizabeth inherited both the tradition and the birds, and she took it seriously. The royal pigeon loft has existed since 1886, and under her reign, it was no mere relic. It remained active, staffed, and occasionally competitive. The pigeons were meticulously bred, trained, and cared for. They weren't pets. They were professional flyers. Racing pigeons can travel hundreds of miles at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. And the Queen, she knew their stats, their lineage, their quirks. She even donated royal pigeons to compete in international races. And in 2019, one of her birds placed in the top 10 in a major Belgian competition. The Queen didn't brag. She didn't need to. The pigeons did the talking. It wasn't exactly common knowledge either. Most people never suspected that amidst her duties, shaking hands, reading state papers, hosting banquets, the Queen also found time to check in on pigeons. But she did, quietly, often while at Sandringham, where she could wander the grounds and visit the lofts without an audience. Some found it odd. Others found it wonderfully old-fashioned. But to the Queen, it was tradition and consistency. Racing pigeons, like many of her other hobbies, were part of the rhythm of a life that otherwise offered very little privacy or spontaneity. They were also, perhaps, a rare form of freedom she could observe from a distance. The birds flew, they traveled, they returned. All things she did herself, in far more ceremonial ways. But when the Queen wasn't checking on birds or handling state matters, she occasionally joined in something more communal, barbecues. And though she rarely cooked herself, her enjoyment of these outdoor gatherings revealed a surprising informality behind the crown. 33. She enjoyed barbecues. Rarely cooked, but loved attending. There are few images more disarming than Queen Elizabeth II standing near a smoking grill, wearing a scarf, smiling faintly, while Prince Philip flips sausages like he's auditioning for a cooking show. But yes, the Queen loved a good barbecue. Not flashy, not catered with gold-plated tongs, just straightforward, well-organized, and strangely relaxing. Whether at Balmoral or Sandringham, barbecues became a semi-regular tradition during royal holidays. And while she almost never cooked herself, she was absolutely present, observing, laughing quietly, enjoying the informality. Prince Philip was usually in charge of the grill. He took it seriously. Too seriously, some joked. He'd manage the fire, organize the setup, select the marinades. Other members of the family, including Charles and later William, would assist. The Queen, meanwhile, handled the role of unofficial overseer. Not hands-on, but never checked out. Guests who attended these informal royal barbecues often came away stunned. Not because the food was extravagant, it wasn't, but because the Queen was, for once, just there. Sitting, eating, chatting about weather and animals, laughing at Philip's jokes, not performing, just existing. She still dressed appropriately, of course. There were no sweatpants or ketchup-stained aprons, but there was a softness to her during these events. No protocols, no speeches, just smoke, grilled meat, and corgis loitering near picnic tables waiting for crumbs. And when the food was done, the Queen helped decide when it was time to wrap up. She didn't rush people, but she had a sense for when the moment was finished. She'd offer a word, a smile, maybe a glance at her watch, and that was the signal. The gathering would quietly shift toward its dignified end. It's in moments like this that the Queen felt most paradoxical. A woman of unreachable status, quietly enjoying something as mundane and democratic as a backyard cookout. But just because the event was casual didn't mean she welcomed surprises. In fact, the Queen had a particular aversion to improvisation, especially when it interfered with ceremonial order. 34. She disliked improvisation during ceremonies. In a world where every second of public life is scheduled, scripted, and rehearsed to the minute, Queen Elizabeth II developed an instinctive allergy to one particular threat: improvisation. To the Queen, ceremonial events were like orchestras. Every bow, every nod, every entrance and exit timed with almost metronomic discipline. She wasn't being difficult. She simply understood something others often forgot. When royalty deviates, everything unravels. If a speaker went off script, if a procession skipped a beat, if someone added a last-minute surprise tribute or tried to make a heartfelt personal comment not in the official program, the Queen would not scowl. She wouldn't storm off, but she would go very, very still. That silence, the signature royal frost, would descend like fog over the crowd. Insiders say she hated unvetted speeches. She didn't care for grand unscripted gestures, and she loathed last-second changes. Whether it was a bishop adding a few extra words to a sermon or a royal family member deciding to improvise during a toast, the Queen's reaction was always the same: disapproval wrapped in impeccable politeness. To her, ceremonies were not about spontaneity, they were about structure. Structure kept chaos at bay. It ensured that even during moments of national grief or celebration, there was a framework, a rhythm of continuity that outlasted any one person, including herself. Even her own coronation, way back in 1953, was orchestrated like a military operation. Rehearsed dozens of times. Every movement, every pause planned and memorized. She didn't just respect tradition, she trusted it. And trusting tradition meant not ad-libbing your way through a centuries-old ritual. Improvisation belonged to actors, not monarchs. She had no time for winging it. In her eyes, that kind of unpredictability was not charming. It was dangerous. But when things stayed on schedule, she was patient, even forgiving. She didn't need to be surprised. She needed things to run on time and run correctly. Though, of course, not everything could be perfectly controlled. Sometimes, even her beloved accessories failed her. And when that happened, let's just say the royal wrath was reserved for one object in particular, a leaking pen. 35. She had a favorite pen and got visibly annoyed when it leaked. If you've ever seen footage of Queen Elizabeth II signing official documents, you'll notice the same thing every time. A specific type of pen, held with steady hands, gliding across the page in flawless script. The pen was never an afterthought. It was chosen, prepared, and often tested in advance. And when it didn't work, when it sputtered or leaked or smudged, that's when the famously composed monarch showed flashes of something rare. Open irritation. She wasn't prone to tantrums. But pens? Pens tested her patience. Whether it was during ceremonial signings or private correspondence, a faulty pen was the kind of thing that could provoke the sharp intake of breath, the famous tightening of the lips, or, on one very memorable occasion, an actual out-loud complaint. "Oh yes, I can't bear this thing." It happened during a signing ceremony in her later years. The pen had leaked, dark ink on her fingers. She passed it to Camilla and muttered in the kind of tone that could chill paint, "I can't stand this bloody thing. Every stinking time." The moment went viral because for once the polished mask had slipped. Not dramatically, but just enough to remind everyone she was human too. The irony, of course, is that the Queen was known for her handwritten notes. She preferred writing by hand to email or text. Personal thank you notes, condolences, annotations on briefing papers, all done with ink and paper. The pen wasn't just a tool, it was part of her identity. So when it betrayed her, the frustration wasn't trivial. It was symbolic. A leaking pen in the Queen's hand was like a sword with a loose hilt. A breakdown in reliability. A reminder that even after decades of preparation, the smallest things could still go wrong. And yet, even in those moments, she rarely lost her cool. A sigh, a quiet barb, then back to work. But if you think her temper was quiet, wait until you hear about her laugh. Because when that surfaced, unexpectedly, rarely, it had a very different effect. 36. She rarely laughed out loud, but when she did, it startled people. Queen Elizabeth II was not known for belly laughs. She wasn't the sort of person you'd find doubled over in hysterics at a joke, nor did she indulge in theatrical displays of amusement. Her humor was razor-sharp, yes. Her wit, undeniable. But laughter? That was rare. And when it came, it startled people. Witnesses often described it the same way. Short, sudden, high-pitched, almost like a hiccup. Quick, unmistakable, and oddly infectious. It didn't linger. It burst out, then vanished, like steam from a kettle. The silence that followed was always heavier, charged with the realization that something extraordinary had just happened. The Queen had laughed. Some of her staff viewed it as a kind of reward. A laugh from the Queen meant you had said something genuinely clever, not just amusing, but clever and respectful and perfectly timed. It was like winning royal bingo. And she didn't fake it. If she didn't find something funny, she'd give you a polite smile and a courteous nod. But when something did get her, really got her, the laugh would come, light and almost surprising, even to her. There's a famous photo of her with Prince Philip during the Trooping the Color ceremony, both caught mid-laughter in a carriage. No microphones, no script, just a moment of shared amusement. It's rare, precious, and a reminder that beneath the choreography, she was present. Staff say some of her most genuine laughs came from the unexpected. A clumsy corgi, a bad impersonation, an offhanded remark by someone who didn't realize she was in earshot. She didn't need comedy. She just needed honesty. Something real. Her laughter was rare not because she lacked joy, but because she rationed it. Like everything else in her life, it was measured, intentional, precious. And if you ever saw her laugh, really laugh, you weren't just entertained, you were honored. Because in a world of silence, structure, and ceremony, a single unguarded laugh meant more than 1,000 royal proclamations. 37. She once corrected a historian. Mid-sentence. When you live through most of modern history, you don't need to read about it. You were there, and Queen Elizabeth II, having outlasted wars, governments, cultural revolutions, and several iterations of the telephone, developed an uncanny relationship with history, particularly when other people got it wrong. There's a story, recounted by palace insiders, of a historian giving a tour or lecture in one of the royal residences. He was mid-sentence, waxing lyrical about some historical event, detailing how Queen Victoria handled a particular state affair, until he made a slight factual error. Nothing major, a misdated event, a wrong title. The sort of mistake that might slide past anyone else, but not Elizabeth. With quiet precision, she interrupted. Politely, gently, but unmistakably. I believe that was actually 1851, she said, or something to that effect. The historian froze, recalculated, realized she was correct. Of course she was. It wasn't arrogance. It was accuracy. The Queen possessed a kind of memory archive that went beyond just her own life. She inherited the burden of remembering. The history of the monarchy wasn't just a subject to her. It was her job description, and she took it seriously. Many who worked closely with her were astonished by the depth of her knowledge. She remembered state visits from the 1950s. She recalled names, dates, faces. Once, she reportedly corrected a diplomat's recollection of a treaty by quoting the actual phrasing from the original agreement. It wasn't performative. She didn't wave her intelligence around like a flag. But when the facts mattered, and they always mattered to her, she didn't hesitate to clarify. The crown, after all, depends on details. And for a woman who spent her life being written about, misquoted, misrepresented, and mythologized, setting the record straight was a small but vital act of control. And nowhere was that control, that steel trap of a mind, more impressive than in the one subject she could recall better than anyone else: horses. But more specifically, their names. 38. She had an extraordinary memory for names, especially horses. Most people struggle to remember the names of distant cousins or co-workers. Queen Elizabeth II, on the other hand, could recall the names of horses, hundreds of them, dating back decades. We're not just talking about that bay gelding from 1984. We're talking names, breeds, bloodlines, performance records, quirks, and personalities. She remembered who sired who, which stable they came from, what races they ran, and how they behaved under certain riders. It was as if her mind had a dedicated filing cabinet labeled Equine Affairs, Royal Eyes Only. Trainers and stable hands frequently told stories of being caught off guard when the Queen would casually reference a horse's lineage from generations back. Didn't his dam throw a lame foal in '93? She might ask, and she'd be right. Her equestrian memory bordered on the photographic. It wasn't about trivia. It was about care. She knew them because she valued them. Horses weren't just a hobby. They were woven into the very fabric of her identity. Her first riding lesson came before her 5th birthday. Her first horse, a Shetland pony named Peggy, was given to her at age 4. From there, the connection deepened, not just with riding, but with breeding, racing, and the complex inner workings of equine aristocracy. When her horses won races, and they often did, she didn't just accept the trophy and leave. She'd analyze the performance, review the conditions, thank the trainers by name, and sometimes make adjustments to the training regimen. Her involvement was detailed and entirely hands-on. It's easy to romanticize it. Oh, the queen and her horses. But it was more than tradition or aesthetic. It was one of the few domains in her life where she held total agency. No committees, no red boxes. Just her, the stables, and the creature she understood instinctively. And yet, for someone who could handle unpredictable animals with ease, she was strangely sensitive to human unpredictability, especially loud applause, particularly when it was too close. 39. She disliked loud applause. Close to her ears. You would think that after decades of balcony appearances, ceremonies, and waving to adoring crowds, Queen Elizabeth II would be impervious to noise. Applause was her soundtrack. And yet, there was one thing that consistently irritated her. Loud, unrestrained clapping that happened too close to her ears. It wasn't about ego. The Queen didn't mind being applauded. In fact, she understood the role it played, a signal of approval, a form of national punctuation. But when the applause happened indoors, unexpectedly, or right beside her, she visibly winced. A small flinch, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a very polite, very British form of "please don't do that again." Staff were well aware. If you were organizing an event and the Queen was attending, you'd be warned. Keep the applause gentle, or better yet, wait until she's exited the room. Overzealous crowds in small venues? Nightmare. Echoing bursts of clapping in stone cathedrals? Absolutely not. She once attended a small charity performance where the audience began to clap furiously in a confined space. The Queen, seated front and center, showed no visible anger, but she leaned slightly away from the sound, her fingers tightening around her purse, the royal equivalent of a muttered complaint. It wasn't just physical discomfort. It was about decorum. The Queen preferred measured appreciation, formal acknowledgement, enthusiasm that knew when to take a breath. And if you think that's fussy, remember, this is someone who greeted presidents, survived coups, and endured decades of relentless press attention. A bit of clapping wasn't going to break her, but it would be noted, silently, decisively. After all, silence was her favorite medium, which is perhaps why even her shoes weren't entirely hers at first. Because in the Queen's world, even breaking in footwear was a job for someone else. 40. She believed shoes should be broken in by staff. First, in the realm of monarchy, every step matters, literally. And Queen Elizabeth II, who spent most of her adult life walking across polished marble, soggy fields, red carpets, and cobblestones of every imaginable shape, had zero patience for blisters. The solution? She didn't break in her own shoes. Someone else did it for her. This wasn't diva behavior. It was logistics. Her shoes, typically low-heeled, custom-made by Anello and David, were identical in design across dozens of pairs, crafted to minimize discomfort and maintain the illusion of timeless consistency. But even custom shoes need softening. So, to avoid the indignity of limping through state banquets, one of her longtime dressers reportedly wore them in around the palace first. Same foot size, similar stride. The dresser would walk the halls, gradually easing the stiffness from the leather, ensuring that by the time the Queen wore them, they were perfectly molded and flexible. Like most royal habits, it was both absurd and strangely sensible. This tiny ritual reveals a lot. The Queen didn't have time for sore feet. Every public appearance was a performance. Every event involved standing, walking, posing, inspecting, and nodding, all while pretending that her footwear didn't exist. Pain was never part of the performance. Comfort was non-negotiable. The strategy also fed into a larger truth. Elizabeth was obsessed with consistency. Her wardrobe rarely changed. Her hats followed patterns. Her shoes? Nearly indistinguishable from pair to pair. That wasn't laziness. It was branding. Subtle, deliberate branding. And yes, once the shoes were broken in, they were rotated and maintained with military precision. Polish, repair, storage, all managed down to the last detail. She might have been Queen of the United Kingdom, but when it came to footwear, she was more like the CEO of a very specialized walking company. And for someone so deeply rooted in tradition, she wasn't exactly quick to embrace technology. Even in an age of iPhones and cloud storage, her preferred communication method remained surprisingly analog and surprisingly charming. 41. She preferred handwritten notes over emails. While the world transitioned into digital dependency, Queen Elizabeth II clung, quite intentionally, to ink and paper. Emails? Rare. Text messages? Unlikely. Slack channels? Absolutely not. For the Queen, the handwritten note remained the gold standard, for communication, for courtesy, and for diplomacy. It wasn't that she feared technology. She had, after all, sent her first email back in 1976, decades before most people even knew what the internet was. But when it came to day-to-day expression, nothing beat a carefully composed letter, written in her own steady cursive, on official stationery embossed with her royal crest. Whether she was thanking a gardener at Balmoral, offering condolences to a distant dignitary, or congratulating a centenarian on reaching 100, she wrote. Not dictated, wrote. Fountain pen, blue-black ink. Neatly folded, precisely worded. Staff noted that she often carried small note cards in her handbag, just in case inspiration struck or a moment of gratitude called for immediate acknowledgement. And when she reviewed government documents or event briefings, she left annotations in the margins, short, sharp, and sometimes surprisingly witty. Every private secretary learned to read between the lines, both literally and diplomatically. There's something almost radical about this commitment to analog communication in an age of digital noise. It was deliberate, measured. Handwritten notes can't be hacked. They don't go viral. They convey thought, presence, time. Her letters were considered keepsakes. People who received them rarely threw them away. Some framed them. Others kept them in safes. Because they weren't mass-produced. They were personal. And when the Queen wrote, you felt the weight of the gesture. It's a small detail, but a revealing one. While the world rushed to make things faster, the Queen remained rooted in deliberation. And when she did do something twice, especially in public, it was always on purpose. Especially when she wanted to make a point no one could miss. 42. She once wore the same outfit. Twice on purpose, to prove a point. If there's one unspoken rule of royal fashion, it's this. You don't repeat outfits. Not because it's a sin, but because every public appearance is archived, photographed, dissected. So the same coat worn twice becomes a headline. But Queen Elizabeth II, in all her subtlety, once broke that rule. Deliberately. She wore the same outfit to 2 major public engagements, not by accident, but to make a point. The act was quiet, unannounced, and surgical in its precision. And yes, the press noticed. So did palace watchers. The speculation began immediately. Was it oversight? Was her team losing control? Was it a protest? No, it was strategy. It's believed that the Queen repeated the outfit, a bright blue coat and matching hat, to send a subtle message about excess and sustainability. At a time when public opinion was turning against opulence, and royal spending was under scrutiny, she made a statement in the least showy way possible, by not shopping. By showing that even the Queen could repeat a look, she undercut the fashion hysteria. She reminded everyone that monarchy isn't about novelty. It's about stability, consistency, continuity. The same coat doesn't mean laziness, it means intent. This wasn't a one-time gesture either. In her later years, Elizabeth became increasingly fond of recycling outfits. She'd restyle coats, re-accessorize dresses, and revive old brooches with new purpose. The message was always the same. Nothing wasted. Everything with meaning. It's a peculiar sort of rebellion. A monarch resisting the pressures of fashion in favor of practicality. She didn't need to impress with change. She impressed with constancy. And if you thought outfit repetition was bold, you should have seen her response to slouching. Because when it came to posture, the queen didn't tolerate laziness, in herself or in anyone around her. 43. She hated slouching and corrected posture. Instantly, posture was not a suggestion in Queen Elizabeth II's presence. It was expected, enforced, and observed with the kind of silent scrutiny that could level even the most confident diplomat. The Queen was a lifelong believer in the power of uprightness, both literal and metaphorical. To slouch in front of her wasn't just sloppy, it was undignified. It projected laziness, weakness, and worst of all, a lack of self-respect. And for someone whose entire identity was bound up in discipline and continuity, poor posture was a kind of betrayal. She didn't need to bark about it. She didn't lecture. She simply corrected. Instantly. Staff have recounted the experience of being subtly nudged, not physically, but through that unmistakable gaze. If your shoulders drooped, you'd feel it, the quiet, piercing look from across the room, a raised eyebrow, a slight tilt of the head, and if you were particularly close to her, you might even get a whispered suggestion. Sit properly, please. She corrected family, too, especially the younger royals. William and Harry reportedly received posture guidance from early childhood. Sitting at state dinners? Back straight, shoulders down, chin level. It was part of their royal education, just as vital as learning to shake hands or wave without looking robotic. This wasn't about vanity. It was about control. In photographs, at ceremonies, in high-stakes meetings, your posture was a signal. It showed readiness, poise, and presence. And in Elizabeth's view, there was never a moment when those things weren't required. She applied the same standards to herself. Even in her 90s, she remained remarkably upright, never sprawling, never slumping into a chair. Watching her sit down was like watching a ballet dancer lower into position, measured, balanced, intentional. To be near her was to rise, literally. And the lesson was clear. If you can't sit up straight for the Queen, how can you stand up for anything else? And while posture mattered in silence, even her accessories were steeped in meaning. Some, in fact, carried superstition, especially the jewels she refused to wear. 44. She had a deep superstition about certain jewels. To the outside world, the Queen's jewelry collection looked like something out of a fantasy novel. Diamonds the size of ice cubes, tiaras with backstories longer than novels, sapphires with their own Wikipedia pages. But within that glittering treasure chest, there were certain pieces Queen Elizabeth II refused to wear. Not because they were ugly, not because they were unfashionable, but because she was, quietly and seriously, superstitious. She never advertised this, of course. Publicly, the Queen was the picture of composure and rationality, but insiders revealed that certain gems gave her pause. Some had bad histories, linked to scandals, family disputes, or ancient political betrayals. Others were rumored to bring misfortune. And when it came to those pieces, she simply left them in the vault. She believed, or at the very least respected the tradition, that objects carry memory. That jewels aren't just ornaments, but witnesses. Some, she felt, had absorbed too much negativity to be worn again. One particular brooch, rarely seen after the 1950s, was rumored to have been involved in a private incident she never spoke of. Others were tied to previous monarchs who had less than glorious ends. This wasn't paranoia. It was reverence. The Queen understood better than anyone that symbols matter. If a gem carried a dark past, wearing it was not just a fashion choice. It was a statement. And sometimes, silence made the stronger one. Of course, many of her favorite pieces had rich histories too, but they were ones she chose to reclaim. Her wedding tiara famously snapped hours before the ceremony. It was repaired in secret, and she wore it anyway, a subtle defiance of bad luck. That was her style. Cautious, but never controlled by fear. She never spoke about these superstitions publicly. She didn't need to. The patterns told the story. Which jewels reappeared, which ones didn't. Because for a woman who ruled by presence, every sparkle had a purpose. And just as she avoided unlucky stones, she also avoided something far more modern: displays of raw public emotion. 45. She disliked public displays of emotion. The Queen didn't cry in public, not often, not even at funerals, not even during national tragedies. And when she did, or appeared to, it made headlines for days. That was the power of her restraint. A single tear became front-page news. It wasn't that she didn't feel. Those who knew her privately described a woman of deep sensitivity and emotional intelligence. But she drew a firm, nearly unshakable line between private emotion and public role. To Elizabeth, the monarch was not there to share in collective catharsis. She was there to anchor it. In times of crisis, she didn't melt down. She stood still. While others wept, she offered steady presence. While others vented, she chose quiet words and reflective pauses. The crown, she believed, should absorb emotion, not reflect it. This wasn't coldness. It was her version of service. When Diana died in 1997, public grief exploded, and the Queen was criticized for not appearing sooner, not crying, not speaking quickly enough. But when she did speak, live from Buckingham Palace, calmly, steadily, she acknowledged the pain without crumbling beneath it. That moment changed the mood, not because she sobbed, but because she stood. Throughout her life, she showed this same emotional discipline. Weddings, funerals, crises, jubilees. She kept a level expression, a soft smile, a respectful nod, a bowed head. Never theatrical, always composed. Even in private, she avoided dramatic emotionalism. Staff knew not to come to her with hand-wringing. She preferred facts, solutions, stillness. That said, she felt everything. It simply wasn't for display. It's easy to judge this restraint through a modern lens, but for Elizabeth, it wasn't repression. It was duty. She believed people needed a monarch who didn't flinch, especially when they did. So while her heart remained private, her presence never wavered. And sometimes, when the cameras were off, she found ways to reconnect with herself, quietly wandering the estates, unseen. Just a woman taking a walk. 46. She enjoyed walking incognito. Around her estates. No crown, no guards, no fuss. Just a scarf tied under her chin, a coat too ordinary for royalty, and a pair of sensible shoes. That's how Queen Elizabeth II liked to take her walks. Alone, incognito, and completely invisible to the outside world. Or at least as invisible as the Queen of England could manage. At Balmoral or Sandringham, she'd often slip away from the palace walls and wander the grounds, sometimes with a dog or two, sometimes completely alone. These weren't power walks. They weren't part of a fitness regimen. They were her private act of rebellion. The one thing she could still do without an audience. Staff referred to these outings as her escape hours. She didn't need conversation. She didn't want fanfare. She just wanted solitude. There, in the fields and forests of her estates, she wasn't performing. She wasn't reigning. She was simply walking. There's a now famous story of one such walk near Balmoral, where she encountered a group of American tourists. They didn't recognize her, asked her if she lived nearby, then asked if she had ever met the Queen. "No," she replied, deadpan. "But he has," she added, pointing to her security officer. That's the kind of humor you only earn after decades of waving from balconies. What makes these walks so striking isn't just the image of a monarch strolling unnoticed. It's what they meant. Elizabeth lived a life of maximum visibility, every move observed, every expression dissected. But these quiet walks were the exception. Moments where she was neither legend nor leader. Just a woman in a raincoat breathing in the air. Even during the busiest times of her reign, she protected this routine. Her staff respected it. Her family learned to give her space when she laced up her boots and picked up her walking stick. And once she returned, she became the queen again, composed, poised, radiant, ready for duty. Because even when off duty, she followed the same unspoken rule. The queen never goes first, not with words, not with clapping, and especially not with applause. 47. She never clapped first. In any room, at any event, in any situation where public applause was expected, the queen waited. This wasn't laziness. It wasn't hesitation. It was protocol. The queen never clapped first, because to do so would be to approve something, publicly, visibly, officially. And you don't hand out royal approval like confetti. You measure it. You wait. Whether at concerts, plays, charity performances, or state dinners, the rule was understood. When Her Majesty began to clap, then everyone else could. Until then, sit tight, hold your hands, read the room, her room. This often created awkward silences. A stirring string quartet might finish a piece to dead air, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because no one wanted to jump the gun. People waited for her. Sometimes she would start the applause. Other times she'd give a gracious nod, a slight smile, and let someone else initiate. A host, a fellow royal, a politician. The cue was subtle but unmistakable. She understood the power of timing. A clap too soon meant eagerness. A clap too late meant indifference. Her rhythm had to be perfect. And it usually was. What's fascinating is how this tiny act became symbolic of her entire reign. Controlled, deliberate, observant. She didn't rush to endorse. She studied. She allowed space. And then, when the moment was right, she acted. But it wasn't cold. When she did clap, it meant something. It was real, earned. From a monarch who rarely gave away more than she had to, applause was a currency of respect. And when paired with her signature expressions, a small nod, a tiny smile, a glint of amusement, it could light up a room. She knew how to hold a silence, and she knew how to break it. And in those rare moments when her emotions snuck past the polished exterior, you might even catch her laughing. But if you really paid attention, you might notice something even rarer, her laugh itself. 48. She had a unique laugh, short, sudden, and easily missed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, and it definitely wasn't the hearty royal guffaw people might expect from someone who spent their life surrounded by men in tights and trumpets. Queen Elizabeth II's laugh was subtle, almost too subtle. A blink and you miss it burst of amusement, sudden, delicate, like a punctuation mark rather than a paragraph. Observers called it a surprise laugh. It came out of nowhere, a soft, high-pitched ha, often accompanied by a slight raise of the shoulders and an almost imperceptible eye twinkle. Then it was gone, as if it had never happened. But when it did, it changed the air in the room. Her laugh had the rare power of transformation. It turned formality into intimacy. It turned staff into confidants. It turned stiff ceremonial moments into shared human ones. Even a single giggle, that light little flash of royal delight, reminded everyone that beneath the tiara and the centuries of tradition was someone very real. And it wasn't random. She laughed when you weren't expecting it. A poorly timed speech, a slightly botched parade maneuver, a corgi doing something deeply undignified at precisely the wrong moment. Her sense of humor was sharp, specific, and often dry to the point of sandpaper. It also revealed her restraint. When she laughed, it was never about dominating a room. It wasn't performative. It was private, a leak in the otherwise airtight vessel of her public self. Palace insiders say it was more common in private, around horses, dogs, and old friends. But every once in a while, in the middle of a perfectly choreographed public event, it would escape. Just long enough to make you smile. Just long enough to remember, oh, there she is, And if something truly displeased her, the laugh vanished, instantly, especially when things felt off. Like, say, if a pen didn't feel quite right against paper. Because if there's one thing she couldn't stand, it was a scratchy pen dragging across royal stationery. 49. She disliked pens that scratched paper. Some people can't stand nails on a chalkboard. For Queen Elizabeth II, the equivalent torment came from a bad pen. Specifically, pens that scratched, dragged, or scuffed across the surface of her stationery like a rusty rake on fresh snow. In the grand hierarchy of royal pet peeves, this one was oddly specific and thoroughly enforced. Her Majesty preferred smooth, gliding pens, ones that flowed, ones that respected the paper. She had no patience for scratchiness, skipping ink, or inconsistent lines. And she could tell immediately. Staff who worked closely with her said she didn't even need to look. The sound alone was enough for her to detect a subpar writing instrument. If a pen offended her sensibilities, it didn't last long. It was quietly removed, never to return. No drama, no outburst, just a discreet swap and a mental note filed under never again. Her favored tools? Fountain pens, of course. Classic, elegant, reliable. Often from brands like Parker or Montblanc. The ink was usually blue-black, formal and serious, just like the woman wielding it. Writing, for Elizabeth, wasn't a throwaway act. She signed documents that changed governments, endorsed policies, and extended honors. The pen was an extension of her authority. And if that extension betrayed her, if it scratched or squeaked, it was a betrayal of tone, of texture, of tradition. This aversion wasn't just about comfort, it was about control. The Queen didn't like unpleasant surprises, especially not in the small rituals of her day. Signing her name, something she'd done thousands of times, was supposed to feel familiar, predictable, not like a dental procedure on parchment. And so the pens were tested, vetted, vigorously pre-approved, because one scratchy stroke was all it took to sour the moment. But if she hated rough writing instruments, she also had no time for weather-related excuses. Even when the skies opened up or the wind howled through royal events, Queen Elizabeth II held fast to her most immovable principle. Tradition never cancels for weather. 50. She refused to break tradition, even for weather, rain or shine, wind or snow, sweltering heat or bone-chilling frost. Queen Elizabeth II did not adjust royal tradition for weather, not ever. It wasn't stubbornness, it was discipline. A belief, deeply held, that the rituals of monarchy should never bend to something as fickle as climate. You'd think that after decades of outdoor events, garden parties, parades, and inspections, she might have relented, that maybe, once, she'd call it off due to an ominous cloud bank. But no. She stood firm. Quite literally. There are photos of her standing stoically under torrential rain, hat pinned firmly, coat buttoned to the chin, not flinching as wind whipped around her. Umbrellas were allowed, but only clear ones, so her face could still be seen by the crowd. That, too, was a calculated choice. Visibility was part of duty. No matter the storm. Even her wardrobe was built for this commitment. Her iconic coats weren't just fashionable. They were weatherproofed. Her hats were structured to withstand gusts. Her gloves gripped during handshakes, even when wet. The Queen wasn't just dressed for the part. She was armored for it. It wasn't about pretending to enjoy the rain. She wasn't immune to discomfort. She just didn't let it interfere. The show had to go on, because in her view, monarchy was about showing up. You don't cancel for drizzle. You don't flinch at the cold. You arrive. You wave. You endure. Staff knew this. So did the public. Crowds would wait for hours in the pouring rain, huddled under umbrellas, knowing she'd be there, dry or not. And she was, because if she didn't show up, what would that signal? That tradition is optional? That symbolism has a weather clause? Not under her reign. And when she did arrive, soaked or sunlit, she always sat in the same spot, because every royal residence had one unchanging rule. The Queen's chair was the Queen's chair, and it was always hers. 51. She had a favorite chair at every residence. Palaces are filled with priceless furniture. Thrones, antique armchairs, ceremonial benches, Victorian chaise lounges, no one dares to sit on. But in every one of Queen Elizabeth II's residences, there existed one chair that was unmistakably, unequivocally hers. Not always the grandest, not the most ornate, not even the most comfortable, but it was hers, chosen, known, and respected. At Balmoral, it was an old armchair near the window, overlooking the lawn where the dogs played. At Windsor, a plush seat near the fireplace, where she read papers and drank her evening Dubonnet. At Buckingham Palace, something a little more formal, upright, positioned for perfect posture, but no less personal. You didn't sit in it, not even if the room was empty, not even if your legs were tired and every other chair was taken. The Queen's chair was not to be used. There were no signs, no labels, just the quiet, universal understanding that this was her place. Staff knew, family knew, guests knew, often by watching the subtle choreography of the room. People positioned themselves around the chair, but never in it. It was like a small, unspoken throne, less symbolic, more sacred. What made it meaningful wasn't just habit, it was presence. That chair held decades of repetition. State papers were read in it. Dogs curled at its base. Conversations unfolded beside it. The Queen's routines, so famously unchanging, were often rooted in that single seat. She might have reigned over nations, but she still had her spot. And woe unto the unsuspecting soul who sat there, not realizing. No reprimand would be needed, just a glance, a pause, a slight clearing of the throat, enough to convey, that's not your chair. Even in death, some say, those chairs were left untouched for a time, as if the air still carried her outline. And if you think that kind of subtle correction was rare, consider this. Once, when a conversation went on too long, she didn't give a hint. She didn't drop a phrase. She simply stood up and walked away. 52. She once ended a conversation by simply walking away. Queen Elizabeth II mastered the art of polite exit. She didn't need a bodyguard to step in. She didn't need an aide to fake a schedule conflict. She had a far more effective technique. She just walked away. No announcement, no excuse, no closing line. If she'd had enough of a conversation, of a guest, of a dull anecdote about some distant relative's new horse, she would simply rise, smile faintly, and glide out of the interaction like fog lifting from a garden. Conversation. Terminated. Social contract. Void. Emotional fallout. Your problem. To be clear, this wasn't rudeness. It was efficiency, honed over decades of having more people want her attention than hours in the day. She had a mental stopwatch for every engagement, and she used it. If you didn't land your point early, or if your story drifted into, this could have been a telegram territory, you were gently, wordlessly dismissed. It happened at state functions, at receptions, even at small family gatherings. Occasionally, a guest would look around in confusion, mid-sentence, only to find they were speaking to a hat, a handbag, and the faint afterglow of a sovereign on the move. Palace insiders knew the drill. Some said there was a rhythm to it, a tilt of the head, a pause after a sentence, and then movement. Others described it as a vanishing act. 1 second she was listening, the next she was inspecting a flower arrangement across the room. She didn't need confrontation. She didn't do sarcasm, well, not always. Her version of "I'm done here" was dignified silence and perfectly timed footsteps. And somehow it worked. No drama, no awkwardness, just a disappearing queen. But while she walked away from people, there was one group she believed never turned their back on her, not out of fear, not out of training, but out of something far stranger, instinct. Because in her mind, the corgis understood the monarchy better than most humans. 53. She reportedly believed corgis understood royal protocol. It sounds like satire, or perhaps the opening line of a very niche children's book. The queen believed her corgis understood royal protocol. But if you spent enough time around Queen Elizabeth II and her small furry army, you'd start to wonder if she was right. The corgis didn't bark at the queen's heels. They didn't jump on her lap uninvited. They didn't chew the furniture, not hers anyway. They seemed to know when to enter a room, when to leave, when to sit, and when to behave. More than one palace aide quietly admitted that the dogs responded to ceremony with better instincts than certain junior royals. They stood at attention during official events. They waited patiently when meals were being served. They even seemed to understand the difference between formal occasions and relaxed family time. Were they trained? Probably, but not to that extent. The queen genuinely believed her corgis just knew. She would refer to them as if they were part of the staff. Not quite footmen, but something close, ambassadors of decorum on 4 legs. And in a bizarre twist of British tradition, no one really questioned it. The dogs had their own rooms, custom meals, and, in later years, their own Christmas stockings. They traveled with her, flew on private planes, posed for official portraits. But above all, they followed the rhythm of the monarchy, never chaotic, never unpredictable. They moved like clockwork with her, through palaces, castles, and countryside. Some thought it was projection, that the queen, ever surrounded by stiff protocol, saw order in her dogs because she needed to. But others weren't so sure. Maybe the dogs picked up on something real, the energy, the timing, the discipline of the world she'd built around herself. Whatever the reason, they remained her most trusted, and arguably most emotionally fluent, companions. No speeches, no scandals, no memoirs, just quiet loyalty. And when one reigns for 70 years, sometimes the deepest truths aren't found in parliament or palace walls, but in the eyes of a dog who already knows when it's time to sit.